Well, welcome everyone to our monthly Health Law and Ethics Network Lunchtime Seminar. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Michelle Taylor-Sands and I'm an Associate Professor at the Melbourne Law School and one of the directors of the network. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on unceded Wurundjeri country and pay my respects to the elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge the different groups of Indigenous people who are the traditional owners of the land on which we all reside. Today, we're delighted to have two speakers who will discuss public views on genomic data sharing and Australian perspective. And both speakers will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, which will leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions. So I'd like to introduce both speakers to start with. Our first speaker will be Dr. Danya Veers. Danya's a social scientist with a genetic counselling background who explores ethical issues relating to genetic testing, and she's also a senior research fellow at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. Danya holds, in addition to that, honorary positions at the University of Melbourne and the Centre for Biomedical Ethics and Law in Leuven. And our second speaker is Dr. Fiona Lynch, who is also a genetic counsellor and postdoctoral researcher with joint affiliations at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute and the Melbourne Law School. And Fiona's PhD focused on rapid genomic sequencing for critically unwell children. So I'll hand over now to Danya, who will start off the presentation. Thanks, Danya.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks for having us here today. Today, Fiona and I are going to present some work that we did, which was exploring the public views on data sharing in Australian context. And this was part of the work we were doing as part of our Centre for the Ethics of Paediatric Genomics, or CP grant, that we received from the MRFF funding about 2.5 years ago. And this is one of the projects that was part of that grant. So just to give you a bit of background, we're talking about genomic sequencing today. And so genomic sequencing technologies are a range of different next generation sequencing technologies, and that includes whole genome, whole exome, and gene panels. And that technology is really important because it's meant that we can actually now sequence a whole bunch of different genes at the same time, rather than just trying to sequence one gene at a time in order to try and find a diagnosis for a patient. So that has had huge implications for clinical care. This whole technology started out in the rare disease setting in research. It moved into cancer genetics. And now it's being mainstreamed, as we call it, which is meaning that it's being used by a whole bunch of different specialties. And that includes things like cardiology, neurology, nephrology, etc. And that is really important because it means that people who don't have genetics training, so doctors who are not genetics trained, might be offering this technology, which has implications for patient care and informed consent processes. There are a lot of benefits from using this technology. So it does increase the rate of gene identification because we can find the genes more readily because we're sequencing more genes at a time. It's a lot cheaper. It improves the time to diagnosis and the quality of care. And it also means that we can reduce unnecessary and invasive tests, particularly if we use this testing earlier in the process rather than later. But it does create some new challenges as well. So we know that if we say, for example, if we're using this technology in a baby who's got a very, very complex condition, and we're looking to try and find the cause of that complex condition, because we're sequencing so many genes at the same time, we actually have a much greater chance of finding incidental findings. So those are things that are disease causing potentially, but unrelated to that clinical question they're asking. So unrelated to the picture that we're seeing in the baby. We also have the opportunity to actively search for secondary findings. So those are also disease-causing gene variants, but they're unrelated to the clinical question, but it's things that we're looking for specifically rather than things we're identifying accidentally as part of the testing process. And lastly, we're actually much more likely to find variants of uncertain significance. And those are variants where you find a change in the gene, but you can't actually determine from the evidence that you have whether it's going to be pathogenic or benign in that patient. So that might change over time as we get more information, but at this point in time, we don't have the evidence to determine whether it's causative or not. So that leads us into why would we store and share genomic data? And that's the topic of our conversation today. So one of the reasons that we might want to share genomic data is because we might want to help our chances of identifying what those variants of uncertain significance mean. And that is a critical part to our future of genomic medicine, is try and solve those unsolved cases. So if we share our genomic data with other databases and try and have that information spread more broadly so that other researchers and clinicians can access it, we're much more likely to increase the chance of a diagnosis for a patient. And that is for the patients right in front of us now, but also patients who might come in the future. It benefits clinical research because we have much more information about potential genetic causes, particularly in rare disease cases, which will increase our gene identification rate as well. One of the issues at the moment that we have is that we need much larger data sets in order to share genomic data. So most of the genomic data we have in databases at the moment is related to rare disease, which is great. But now we're sort of starting to use this, as I said, we're mainstreaming. So we're using genomic sequencing in other specialties and things like heart disease, complex conditions like diabetes, etc. We're going to want to try and find the causes of those as well. And so we need much larger data sets to be able to do that. Another issue at the moment is that we have very limited genetic heterogeneity in these databases. So about 70% of all the cases of the data that we have in these databases currently being shared is of people who have European ancestry. So that means that there are a lot of people around the world who aren't benefiting from these databases and being able to match their genomic data with those database outputs. And that really has huge implications for equity in healthcare. There are other potential uses of sharing genomic data outside the research setting and the clinical setting. Pharmaceutical companies might want to use this data in order to help develop drugs and other treatments. Government bodies, we've heard a bit on the news in the last couple of years about, particularly in the US, about the government bodies, crime-solving agencies trying to identify the killers of particular long unsolved murders. And insurance companies might also want to be able to adapt their premiums in order to try and make the most out of this information, I would say, which may or may not benefit the patients. So there are quite a lot of challenges that we need to think about when we're thinking about how data should be stored and shared. One of the things we need to think about is what types of data should be stored or shared. Should it just be the changes in the DNA, the variants that are put in these databases? Potentially that's not very useful if it isn't accompanied by clinical data as well. So we need to think about the implications of sharing that clinical data, particularly in cases where there might only be a few cases around the world that have the same condition. We need to think about where the data is stored. So should it be stored in a centralized manner, where it means that one organisation potentially is responsible for all of the data and the access to that data and pays for that storage, etc. Or should it be decentralized, which means that each organisation would have their own storage facilities? And what are the implications of both those choices in terms of security and privacy? We need to think about who should have access. So should it just be medical professionals or researchers as well? Should pharmaceutical companies have access too? What about government agencies? And how do you regulate that access? Who's in charge of that? Those decisions about what constitutes a valid use of the data. And on top of all of this, we need to think about how we get informed consent from the patients or participants, and how do we maintain that as things change over time. So we were really interested to hear about what the public thought about all of these issues. So we developed a study where we aimed to explore the public's perspectives on a range of different things, including the benefits and concerns they had around data storage and sharing, issues around who they thought should access the stored data, where and how to store it and share it, and things around data ownership and control. And the context that we used was that we gave them a scenario where we had, similar to what I just used before, we had a very sick baby who we were trying to identify the cause, so they had genomic sequencing. And then we said, well, what do you do after you've identified the cause in that child? What do you do with that data? And so we asked them then to think about the second uses of that data. So we actually recruited via Facebook ads, which was really wonderful. We had lots and lots of people decide to sign up. We had, I think, hundreds. It was over about 300 people who agreed to participate and registered their name. So then we got to be a little bit selective, which was wonderful. So we actually then had, so Fiona screened for eligibility and diversity of the sample. So we tried to get people across a range of different ages, both males and females from around Australia, etc. And then in order to make sure that they weren't sort of too uninformed, then they had some kind of idea about some of the issues, I created a video that sort of explained the data storage and data sharing issues. So similar to what I've outlined today for you, but a little bit more detailed. And if you're not sick of my voice by the end of today, that's the link down the bottom and you can go listen to it. So we performed focus groups that ran for 1.5 hours. And then we audio recorded and transcribed those and analysed that using inductive content analysis. But we also did a really cool thing at the end, which is where Fiona actually throughout the focus group was taking notes about all the different characteristics, the ideas, the concepts that people raised. And we actually got them to vote and rate those at the end of the session, just to tell us what they thought was most important. And that's critical because we're actually going to be using that information to develop a discrete choice experiment with ileus goronitis at the end of this, which should be really interesting. So we conducted 7 focus groups, which had a total of 39 participants. You can see here that the age range was really wide, so between 18 and 67 years of age. We had participants from 4 different states, which is not bad. We had people from both metro and rural areas, and we also had people with and without children. Interestingly, we had quite a lot of people who actually spoke a language other than English. So they spoke English as well, but because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to participate in the focus group. But so it was quite a diverse group, and we did manage to get some males. What was quite interesting was that we had 6 people who were either medical or allied health professionals. We had 14 people who self-report as having experience with genetic testing, and 6 who had themselves or a family member had a diagnosis of a medical condition as well. So I guess that means it was maybe a slightly skewed sample. So we had people who were probably a bit more informed about medical stuff than others. So Fiona and I are going to talk about 4 different aspects of the results that came out of today. And I'm going to take the first 2 and then Fiona will take the second 2. So there was overall quite a lot of support for data storage. So people were mostly in support of that. And they were quite comfortable with data reuse as long as consent was provided and if it was going to benefit the wider community. So this person said, I definitely think with appropriate permissions, the data should be stored. But not everyone was so sure about this, and some people felt that it wasn't really a simple kind of black or white or yes or no answer. So this person said it depends on the context of why the data is being collected. What are the potential benefits of saving the data? I don't think it's a black and white issue, like every genomic sequence should be saved. People expressed quite a lot of benefits associated with sharing with health professionals, and they thought that this was something that should be done quite quickly and potentially without consent, because this time is of the essence when you're treating patients. So as this person said, I might be stating the obvious, but your doctors and your specialists should have immediate access to it. It should be readily available and quickly. They were also quite positive about sharing with researchers, and they recognised that the researchers needed to have access to the data, but there might be some difficulties in gaining access to it, depending on consent. But they really felt that because researchers are generally sort of pretty unself-serving, they prefer performing a service to society rather than personal gain, like some companies, that this should be pretty readily available to researchers. So as this person said, in principle, my view is unis, hospitals, organisations that exist in our society, ultimately for the greater good. However, you sharing my data with them, I'm a lot more open because they don't exist to make a profit for their shareholders. There were quite a lot of varying views about sharing with family members. So while some recognise that there were a lot of benefits that could be received by family members with whom data was shared, and that they thought this could be automatic if that was the case, but not everyone really felt that way. Some people felt that privacy should be protected and therefore sharing shouldn't be automatic. And then others, there was one person who said that sharing might be a bit useless with family members if it was done with the family member directly rather than a health professional. And this person said, if my relative wants my genetic data for some very implicit reasons, I personally would not be very comfortable because I don't think most people have enough, I think, knowledge to read the genomic data and know what that means. So overall, there was a consensus that consent should be sought for this sort of sharing. So as this person said, I think it's probably more flexible to require consent because different families have different circumstances. So if that is in place, it's more flexible and more inclusive to different people's needs. There was a lot of discussion about who should have access to genomic data. So this took up a lot of the conversation. There were concerns about being this sort of discrimination that might occur if you shared with employers. So as this person said, I guess we're dealing with diseases and illnesses and mental health issues, etc., which is really, really sensitive. And there's still a lot of discrimination and stigma and shame that stems from that. So if it got into the wrong hands, I think it could be potentially very individually quite confronting and potentially damaging. Like, does the employer have access to it? I think there's a lot of risk there. People were a bit ambivalent about sharing with pharmaceutical companies. So some people felt that there was a lot of lack of trust in these sort of profit-driven entities that were run privately. So this person said, in the case of pharmaceutical companies, I think they've rightly got most people's distrust. There's been ample, very recent examples of where they've done the wrong thing by people. They've made data suit their outcomes so that they can get drug approval where it might not be warranted for off-label uses, blockbuster drugs where they don't necessarily need to be used. So I think people have come to distrust pharmaceutical companies because of their largely profit-driven MO. But having said that, there was also some recognition that they do actually do things like develop medications and treatments. So it wasn't quite so straightforward to say that all pharmaceutical companies were doing the wrong thing. So this person said, I think in a general sense, I'm nervous about anyone that can profit using that information, that can profit financially. I've also been very impressed when there's a particular drug that's developed where there isn't a patent on it and it's cheaper and it's more accessible. So for me, I sort of go, well, that's more concerned about health than profit. Whereas when certain medications with patents on it, all kinds of things, and it sort of starts to come across as being more about profit than health is where there's a concern. Insurance companies were another, obviously quite a hot topic. Most people felt that sharing with these organisations would not really be very helpful for patients or participants. So as this person said, because the insurance companies' access would directly impact the individuals financially, because they may want to, it's just too sensitive, that will make you be excluded from claiming some compensation or whatever. So I think that direct financial impact on the original owner of the data is really preventing the sharing to insurance companies. And there was a sort of a general sense of distrust around insurance companies, and I guess they're not really well known for their altruism. And there was a lot of concern about discrimination, particularly when we're talking about offering and costing policies. And we are talking about quite a vulnerable group because we're talking about people who already have existing health issues. So as this person said, I can't really think of any advantages to sharing to insurance companies. I think they would love to just get their hands on that information and there would be discrimination. And so for many people, it would be very hard to be insured. So I can't think of a reason to do that. There were some people who recognised that sharing with insurance companies might have some benefits. So they would be able to tailor premiums so that people who didn't need to have as high care because they didn't have a genetic condition, for example, or a predisposition, wouldn't need to pay as much. And some people recognise that there could be more stability for the insurance industry at large. But interestingly, even though the people recognised these things, they didn't necessarily agree that that was appropriate. So as this person said, I can see how the argument might be, okay, well, if we incorporate some of this information into our health insurance premiums or whatever, the people who don't have any underlying genetic condition can get cheaper health insurance. But I could see how that could be the argument, and I think that's absolutely ridiculous. And then we talked about sharing with law enforcement agencies, and some people felt that that should be automatic, so you wouldn't have to give consent to do that. And that's because it's a justice issue. So we're talking about people who have done a crime, and therefore they should be caught, and the sharing should be able to facilitate that. So as this person said, it should be automatic because this is something that is against the moral values of society. And so the consent for this sort of data access or access of this data is not necessary at that point in time. But other people raised issues of inequity again around the fact that these were people who had existing medical conditions and therefore they could be more disadvantaged than other people by sharing their data, particularly without consent. There was some discomfort about the fact that we're talking about kids here. And so obviously it's parents who are going to be consenting on behalf of their children, if that was the case. And also that if this was going to happen, this sharing with organisations without consent particularly, it may deter individuals from sharing. So as this person said, I think that the idea of that access would be enough to put so many people off. People are so concerned about this idea that they'll be tracked and traced by the police, and this will come back to bite them. That risk of deterring people participating outweighs any benefit that you might get. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Fiona.
Thanks, Danya. Okay, so Danya's run us through the first two categories of our data, and I'm going to run us through the second two. So this third category of ours was really about logistics of data storage and sharing. So this is really all about the practicalities of participants' views and preferences about data storage and sharing. So to start off with, participants really favoured centralised storage over decentralised storage. So having some kind of centralised facility to keep all of the data in one place. And they really recognised that this boosted accessibility and linkage, that having all of the data together really made it accessible for people to access. So the centralisation of storage of these things brings with it a whole lot of potential benefits, as well as for that sort of advancement of science, in terms of having it all in one place and enabling the linkage of different data sets. They also saw centralised storage as more secure. So I just think that if they weren't stored centrally and they were stored in each research facility, it would be something like a breach of privacy might be more likely to occur in that sort of area, because each organisation is different. Maybe the way they store the data might be different as well. So we talked a little bit about cloud-based storage versus physical storage as well, and participants raised some security as well as technological concerns for cloud-based storage. So if you're talking about something that is a physical storage device, then you've got less of a chance of hacking or that information being accidentally shared. But when you're talking about something that's stored in some kind of internet space, that does open up a can of worms for things like viruses and other technological issues. Some participants suggested that data donors might want to be able to store their own data. So they saw this as easing some of that organisational burden in that research facilities or whoever was responsible for storing the data didn't have to manage and pay for that storage. But they also recognised that this reduced the accessibility of the data. So it was less easily able to be shared if each data donor was storing their own data. So from a storage and cost perspective, it would be interesting to consider individuals being given the option to, we can't afford to store your data currently, but do you want to take your data? And then we can put you on a list of people where if someone wants to access that, they can contact you. I mean, obviously, yes, it's a big file, but if everyone's only got their own file, then that significantly eases the burden of storing it. Makes it hard to access, but when the alternative is potentially deleting it entirely, it would be an option. So this was seen as a bit of a bridging step, I guess, for some participants. We also talked about data ownership, control, and regulation. So we talked about who should be responsible for storing and managing that data. For lots of people, government was the most obvious organisation who should be responsible for storing the data. So hopefully it can be managed by government or something like that, so it's not private. But others had concerns about government organisations being in charge of storing that data. So I think there's been numerous occasions where the government has failed to properly protect our data, and I think I'd be more wary about genomic data storage if I knew the government was in charge. Some participants raised research institutes as potential organisations to store the data, and they saw these organisations as being less money focused, and this was really important to them. So I think that it should be held in control of something like the Murdoch Research Institute, rather than a third-party body who'd be more interested in the money side of it. So I think it needs to be held by a responsible body who would literally be there for the genetics and not as a business. Overall, irrespective of who was storing that data, organisational trust was really important to participants. So for this participant, for example, I'd be less trusting of, say, a government health system versus a private organisation, because I'd be questioning whether the private organisation is for profit and whether that's going to influence what they do with the data. Participants also discussed who owned the data once it had been stored. So most felt that patients or the parents, guardians of paediatric patients should retain ownership of their data, but they recognised this wasn't always the case in the way that health data was stored currently. So who owns that data? Can I sell it? Is somebody going to financially profit off that data at some point? Does it belong to me? Who does it belong to? I think it should belong to the person who has it, but I think the way our society works is whoever paid for it owns it, really. I think in reality, they own that, but I think that the person should. Independent regulation of data storage and sharing was also really important to participants. And they saw this as a really important way to ensure that sort of security of the data and ethical sharing and use of that data. So I would think something this massive and this potentially sensitive would almost need its own separate entity established for this specific purpose. It almost would need to be something completely independent from anything that already exists. Participants also talked about the importance of a really well-constructed regulatory framework for protection of that data. So I think if you have a framework set up like a regulatory framework, I know that regulations can be seen as a bit of a dirty word sometimes, but I think it's actually a good thing and can actually stop people doing the wrong thing. And I think if you have a framework in place, then it should go some way to actually stop its misuse. Along the same lines, participants saw it was really important to have some kind of consequences for misuse of the data. So they wanted to see repercussions and accountability if someone was using the data in a way that was deemed inappropriate or unethical. So if your data was misused and if it was to cause an individual some sort of harm, do the people who store the data, keep the data or use it, what sort of liability they might accept to compensate or make amends or rectify any unintended consequences or harm that might come about as a result of misuse. So participants also considered the benefits and limitations of broad versus specific consent. And here we're talking about broad consent as in consenting for a whole series of things at once, or specific as in being able to make decisions about each individual use of the data or who the data was being shared with. So participants saw that kind of broad consent as really convenient for researchers in that it really facilitated that wide research, but they were more attracted to specific consent because it allowed them more control over how their data was being used. So I think that regaining consent every time the data is shared is really important for me personally. I'd like to be contacted every single time because you just would want to know where your data was going. Some participants talked about wanting ready access to information about their data. They wanted to be updated about how their data was being used and shared. And this again came down to wanting to maintain that control. So people should have some sort of ownership and governance over that data and how that data is used. And because of this, they really favoured those dynamic models for consent. So being able to change their preferences over time. So I think that it would be good to have it being able to change it at any time you like, just because you might have different opinions in the future because people's thoughts keep changing. And participants felt that this change in preferences and being able to change your consent preferences should be easily done. And they suggested something like an online platform as a really convenient way, an accessible way to do this. So if it is one of these online systems where, yeah, I think that would be great for convenience, that you can log in and just say, don't wish to share this, or these are the specific people I want to share it with, or even if you do want the data to then be destroyed. However, participants were cognizant that this kind of dynamic consent, changing your consent over time might be burdensome and a barrier to research. So are we also all going to read the individual research proposals that are going to happen with our genetic data? Because how many of us read the terms and conditions when our phones are updated? If we had something like that, 40 pages long come through each time, are we going to read it every single time if we see like 20 of those a week? To combat this, some suggested that reconsent should only be required for new uses of the data or if policies and procedures changed. So I think for convenience, it's probably better to have a preset consent for a list of trusted purposes. However, if there are other uses outside of that list or outside of that scope or the purpose, then I don't mind to get a consent separately, but I would think it's convenient. I think that's meant to say inconvenient to consent too frequently. So other participants said that being recontacted time and time again was acceptable as long as it wasn't too frequent. And we had some discussions about how frequent too frequent was. So to have to provide consent every single time would be a hassle if it's frequent access. But if it's like once a year or once every couple of years, then it's not such a concern. Overall, participants thought that patients or parents and guardians of child patients should be given as much choice as possible about how their data was shared and used. So I think we kind of need to take it as a case by case. Some people might be fine for their data to be accessed, and then other people that are a bit more wary. And importantly, participants agreed that people's decisions about how their data was stored and shared should be informed. I think when you're trying to store data, you should be telling them about the benefits and the risks and allowing them to have that information before they make that decision. Participants also agreed that consent should be explicit so that it shouldn't just be the default option that data is stored, for example. So data storage should be opt-in rather than that sort of that default option. So whether the consent is opt-in or implied, I would err on the side of opt-in because it seems to me to lend itself most naturally to the most informed consent rather than the sort of assumption that this is just part of the process of the treatment of the child or whatever. But I think when you have opt-in consent, it sort of stops the parents and not forces them, but encourages them to consider more deeply and understand more about the steps that are involved in their child's treatment or whatever's happening with their child. Participants also highlighted some of those additional complexities with parents giving consent for on behalf of their children. And this was particularly centered around the long-term nature of storage. So we talked a lot about what would happen when a child reached the age of maturity, so 18 years, and whether that data would continue to be stored after that time. And most agreed that children should be provided that option to reconsent or make their own decision when they reached adulthood. So as that child reaches an age where they can consent, they should be asked again whether they continue to use it or whether they don't want their data used anymore. I do think that that's an important consideration when you're talking about children's data, that they have a say once they're older. So just some final thoughts on our data and the findings from this study. So we really found that it was difficult to develop a one-size-fits-all approach, that there was quite a lot of heterogeneity in participants' thoughts and preferences. So participants were mostly in favour of storing data, but how the data was used was really important to them. So the purpose of that data storage and sharing was most important. Participants were mostly in support of sharing with health professionals and researchers, but they had less trust in pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies, and governmental organisations was an interesting one as well, that participants demonstrated quite a bit of distrust in. Participants really had conflicting views on who should store and take responsibility for the data, but irrespective of who that was, that organisational trust was a really recurrent theme. and was really important to participants when deciding whether to store and share that data. I think a really big theme from our data too is that control was important and consent is key. Participants didn't want anything happening to their data without their knowledge or their consent. But I think here there are some real questions about what's realistically feasible here. So what participants want is not necessarily what we can offer. And I think there's some really important discussions to be made here about sort of weighing up those different pros and cons, along with financial considerations and other considerations. Just a shout out to our co-authors who've contributed to this study. And of course, a huge thanks to all of the participants who were involved. We had some really, really wonderful participants, Danya, I think you'll agree, and some really, really great discussions. So thank you. And we'd really love to take some questions and have some further discussions.
Thanks, Fiona. Gosh, there's so many aspects to cover, aren't there? It's just a can of worms. So fascinating, really interesting insights. Thanks for sharing them with us. So yeah, as Fiona suggested, if people can put their hands up either virtually or like that, we can start with some questions, and also feel free to add anything to the chat as well. I'll just keep looking at the chat too. So does anyone have a question to start with? I just had a quick question. Oh, sorry, you go.
I was going to say there's one in the chat that Leo has put forward that might be interesting, and Fiona might want to take that one. It's sort of like about comparing with other types of data.
Yeah. So I think we had so much data. I'm already drawing on things that maybe we didn't share, Danya. Participants did draw some comparisons with other types of personal data. So these particularly were around things like sharing data with Facebook and other social media platforms. And that sort of framed, I guess, how they thought about genomic data. I think participants saw lots of similarities, that people chose to share lots of information on Facebook with very little consideration for things like terms and conditions and social media platform policies and things. And so I think they saw that participants might do similar things with genomic data, though they did recognise that it was particularly different. And I guess this is something that's been certainly discussed before in literature about genetic exceptionalism and genomic data being different and special. I think, does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
There's another question in the chat. How did you think your data differed when directed towards a pediatric genome data versus adult data?
I think it was quite hard to keep people just talking about the pediatric setting, because I guess like everyone we spoke to was adults. So some people had children, some people didn't. So I think that we sort of fluctuated quite a lot about sharing around adult data versus children's data. So I guess I think when we're talking about the pediatric, people were probably like a little bit more protective in a way. But I wouldn't say that was necessarily, it was a bit hard to sort of like tease out between the two, just because people were so, I mean, we actually went in with the sort of the instruction that people should think about it as though they were sort of policymakers rather than doing it for their own benefit, and thinking about the kind of policy recommendations they would make rather than what they wanted themselves. But I think that's, even if people go in thinking that initially, people obviously, are automatically comparing it to their own perspectives and their own values. So I think it's pretty hard to tease that out.
So I think the next person who had their hand up was John Anthony. Yes, good.
So my question is for those of us, so how do we make our genetic data more publicly available?
I think that's a great question, John. And I think the whole, purpose of our study is that these kinds of platforms are not yet in place. So I think, unless it's part of a specific research study, from what I understand at the moment, there aren't these big publicly accessible genomic databases that researchers and health professionals and other organisations can draw on. Is that your understanding of it, Danya?
Yeah. I guess the thing that what we're trying to achieve from our study is trying to understand why people may be less willing to share their data. And so we can try and figure out what kinds of education we need to be doing, as well as trying to develop the platforms and everything to make it as secure as possible and accessible as possible, and finding those balance points.
And also, I'm saying, in my opinion, I'd pretty much say, I suppose, if people had good genetic data, we'd want to have our genetic data publicly available. Whereas people, I suppose, had maybe issues, I suppose, with the quality of data, I suppose, they may want to keep it private, maybe. I'm not sure, this is my guess.
Yeah, that's possible.
Thank you. And Delka, I think you were next.
And thank you. I really enjoyed the seminar, and I really love to connect, because I've done quite a lot of work around this in the context of direct consumer genetic testing, but from a legal perspective. And I've looked at the online terms and conditions, and I've also just run a public survey on privacy perceptions in that context. So I think it would be really great to talk to you a bit more about that. But did you get to ask or a feel for how people's views really differed in a commercial context versus a public context? I sort of got a little bit of that from the presentation today, but I was just wondering. Sorry, I'm trying to cram a lot in this.
There was certainly lots of difference in participants' perspectives of sharing their data with private versus public organisations. I think overall participants were really altruistic when it came to things like sharing their data for the benefit of research and public health generally. I guess they were really concerned about, and this really came back to private organisations profiting from their data. So I guess they saw they didn't have those same altruistic feelings when sharing with insurance companies, for example, or employers was another one that came up. But then there were those organizations like pharmaceutical companies, which they kind of saw that dual nature of. So they recognized that pharmaceutical companies were for profit, but that they also generated quite a lot of beneficial research. And so there was that kind of tension there in the dual purpose of those kinds of companies.
Yeah, thanks, because I think it sort of matches with what we found, because we've just run the survey this year at 1,000 New Zealanders and 1,000 Australians. And there's definitely far more comfort with sharing with doctors. And once it gets both in New Zealand and Australia to sharing with government entities, they're really far less keen. So I could see there's quite a bit of sort of similar findings in your focus groups. And the other thing, just on the pharmaceutical note, in the commercial context, because a lot of these direct consumer testing companies are engaging in partnerships with the pharma industry, like for instance, 23andMe entered into at least 15 partnerships with pharmaceutical companies. So that really means there's a lot of potential for data sharing. So I think it's really good that you're talking to people about these issues too, particularly people with health conditions. So thank you very much.
Thanks. I just want to say I think it was a really valuable experience to actually, I think surveys are amazing, and I think they give you a really good idea what to focus in on and narrow in on in some of these discussions a little bit, because it meant that we could get some of that nuance about the reasons why people felt certain ways about sharing or not sharing with different organizations. So yeah, hopefully it would be great to connect and can compare our results a bit more.
Thank you so much.
Ainsley, I think you were next.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I think I know lots of people, but Ainsley Newsom from University of Sydney. Thanks for a lovely talk, Fiona and Danya. Actually, just on the note in response to John's question about sharing and how to do that, I have a feeling there is a patient initiated repository somewhere, particularly in the rare disease context, but I've just tried to find it and I've been unsuccessful. But I have heard about initiatives like that happening globally with a view to bringing together people who might not otherwise be connected to drive research and discovery. So if I do find it, I'll let you know. But my question was going to be around one of your slides towards the end. I think it was you, Fiona. You were talking about a desire for regulation, or this to happen in a regulated environment. And I think we have a tendency, or maybe the public or certain members of the public have a tendency to see regulation as the holy grail, to see it as the clarifying entity that can just sort everything out. Yet anyone who works in law knows that it's not that simple in practice, and actually can give rise to just as many difficulties and opaqueness as an ethical argument might, for example. So I was just wondering, in your data, did you drill down on that at all? Did you discuss how regulation might work? Were there particular scenarios that it seemed to come out about more than others? Because obviously it's not a single entity.
I'm happy to give that a go. We didn't drill down on it very much. And I think really our findings were just that participants wanted some kind of perception of someone being responsible. And I think as well, those wanting some kind of accountability, some kind of if someone did something wrong with the data, that there were some kind of consequences for that. But exactly how that worked, no, we didn't get into much detail about. I think it was really just, yeah, participants wanting to see that someone was on the lookout, I guess. Is that sort of the feelings that you got, Danielle?
Yeah, I guess it was important who that someone was, though. And I think that, you know, what we mentioned in the slides, but I think that it had to be a really trusted organisation. And for some that was definitely not government, and for other people they thought government was the best person. So I guess it's interesting how people's own personal views and experiences come into that regulation question. And I think, yeah, just even the fact that some people like, you know, I guess there were quite a lot of misconceptions around, you know, data security, but like being, if you're doing cloud storage, that might be less secure than if you're doing it as an organizational thing. And I think that that's part of what I mean about some of the educational issues that we need to kind of think about as a result of this study, because I think that if we want people to feel secure, obviously it matters who's storing it and how they're storing it. And we want to make sure that people appreciate that they are doing it in the best way possible. So I think the Australian genomics recommendations that are coming out, the NAGIM guidelines, that will be really helpful, I think, in trying to show that this has been researched quite well, and that we have a plan, and we need to then make sure that that the public understands that is a well thought out plan.
Now, John, I think you've got your hand up. I don't know if that's a hangover from last time or a new question.
Okay, I suppose. So within the next 20 to 30 years' time, with human genetic engineering on human fertilized eggs, I'm saying we'll start to see the emergence of new species beyond humans on Earth, I'm saying. And with the occurs, I suppose, if there were to be very good quality genetic database, I'm saying, when parents could be choosing a certain genetic-based quality for their children, I'm saying, based upon a huge genetic database, I'm saying, of all the different types of genes, I suppose, within humans on planet Earth.
I'm sorry, I don't think I understand what the question was. Was that just a comment?
So there's kind of a comment, I suppose, more based on the fact, I suppose, I'm saying that right now you're talking here about the storage of genetic information via genes, I'm saying, within genomes, I'm saying. And I'm saying that in 20, 30 years' time, I'm saying we'll be able to begin to see the emergence of new species beyond humans, I'm saying. Because if you look at humans now, we perceive the world pretty similar to how humans for the world 2,000 years ago. But I'm saying with the use of genetic engineering on fertilized eggs, I'm saying, well, then we'll start to be seeing the emergence of new species beyond humans, I'm saying, which is why it's important to get the legal framework right, I'm saying, for these genetic database, I'm saying, because in the future, I think that parents will be able to choose a certain gene quality, I'm saying, for their kids based upon the huge libraries of genes, I'm saying, within those genetic databases.
I think that sounds like perhaps more of a comment about getting the framework right. I think, yeah, moving forward. Thanks, John. I just had a question that sort of goes back to something you said initially, Danya, about the 70% of the current sort of genetic data being from European heritage. I'm sort of interested to know sort of what the reason for that is, and how you might sort of address that from an equity issue moving forward, because obviously it's a significant issue.
Yeah, so I guess the short answer in terms of why that's the case is funding. Who gets the funding and then what they decide to do with it. And obviously, like when we're talking about the big funded bodies in the world, the US does a lot of this research, and they have, you know, maybe not the most diverse population compared to other countries around the world. So that's probably where a lot of it comes from. And obviously the UK is doing a lot as well. So that's why the databases are full of European genomes. But I guess in terms of how we can move forward, I think that there are some pretty big initiatives that are starting to move up. And I think that there's been a bit more of a focus on trying to really expand the genetic diversity in these databases. So even in Australia, there's a plan to produce a more representative database to try and help different populations that are more, that we have more of in Australia compared to other groups around the world. So that's going to be starting hopefully very soon. And so I think that this is something that needs to happen. It's really important because when we're looking at the databases and we were trying to compare genomes of people from not unrepresented ancestries, it means that the variants that we're seeing in those other populations, they might actually be quite common in those populations, but we see them as rare variants because we don't see them in the databases that we already have. So that means that we're getting like overcalling of diseases in those populations, which obviously has a lot of implications for healthcare in general. So we need to make sure that we are expanding the diversity. And I think it's starting to happen, but you know, we're trying to bridge that gap when you've got a 70% rate is quite hard, but it'll come with time.
Thanks, Danya. Megan, you've got your hand up.
Thanks very much, Michelle, and thanks for a great presentation, Fiona and Danya. I suppose my question is reflecting on your work, and you know, I was reflecting on some work that I've done in a similar space on genomic data collection and disclosure through networked electronic medical records, excuse me. I think what has emerged through your project very strongly is the variability in people's views, or the variation in people's views, and the wide range of, you know, preferences for different privacy settings, and the fact that dynamic consent was raised as a potential solution, but then that, you know, some people thought that would be unduly burdensome, and would people actually go in and take the time to control their data in the way that dynamic consent enables. So my question really is, where do you think that leaves us in terms of next steps? What framework or what approach should we be using to guide you know, approaches to data sharing that can accommodate these diverse preferences?
Do you want me to have a first crack at that, Fiona?
Please.
Because I think it's really hard, is the point.
I think it's really hard as well. And I think what we're trying to get to with Fiona's last point is that just because people want something doesn't mean that it's the best thing. And I think that we need to, like, obviously taking perspectives of the public into account is super, super important. We want to understand their views and their preferences. But I think that what you really need to try and understand is what their acceptability is, as well as their preferences, and match that with what is best in terms of like security issues and accessibility issues, and then find a balance between all of that. And that's why I think that the discrete choice experiments we're going to be doing based on this data is going to be really helpful, because we're going to be presenting people with some trade-offs that'll help us figure out what do they value more when you have to make choices about some of the things. You can't have everything. So we have to figure out what do they value more, and then you can sort of try and feed that into the comparisons with what is most appropriate from an ethical perspective as well. So I'm not sure I really gave you a very solid answer, but that's part of it.
I think that's probably spot on. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Look, I think we're just 2 minutes to go, so we're just about time. I just wanted to thank you both for such a fascinating insight, and so many questions raised, but really helpful to get that sort of initial feedback. So thanks so much for sharing that with us. And thank you everyone for your questions. Really raised a lot of questions. And there's also some links in the chat on, if people were following the chat, there's a few people have put in a couple of links to source resources and things like that. So that's worth having a look at. I think Paula was also just going to add to the chat. Yeah, great. Thanks, Paula. Just a couple of links for anyone who's not on our mailing list, on the Health, Law and Ethics mailing list. If you'd like to join, there's a link in the chat there, and you can just click on that. It'll take you to our website. You can also just go to our website and click on the link to get connected to our mailing list. And there's also, we put all the recordings of past seminars on that, and there's also details about upcoming seminars. So if you want to keep up to date with what we're doing at HLEN and the further research seminars, just either click on those links or join, or just put in our HLEN website, and you'll have a link to join the mailing list there. But thank you again, everyone. It's been fantastic to share the discussion, and hopefully we'll see some of you again next month. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.